afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharina Betters, Access for San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools. And along with Daniel Marmolejo, Intergovernmental Relations Safety for SBCSS, we will serve as the moderators for this panel discussion. To be transparent, we will not leave today with closure or healed wounds regarding race, racism, policing, the criminal justice system, civil unrest and activism, or the array of things that are shaping our current reality. Although today's issues are not nuanced, we recognize that it will take nuanced thinking and solutions to do the deep work toward achieving a just and equitable society. Our goal for today is to hear from our panelists and get understanding from their perspective on our current context, and then continue this level of engagement as meaningful dialogue on the road to equity and systemic change within our communities, our governing bodies, our schools, and our legal system. To help guide future forums on these topics, please use the chat feature to ask questions or provide comments and suggestions so we can be responsive to those needs in our planning for other opportunities such as this. Here, with opening remarks, is our County Superintendent of Schools, Mr. Ted Alejandre.
Thank you, Dr. Betters and Mr. Marmolejo, and thank you to all the panelists who are part of today's important program. We really appreciate your time and commitment to addressing this important topic. As you know, all of our schools have been closed since early March due to COVID-19, yet we've seen so much collaboration, dedication, and tremendous efforts of educators and community stakeholders to provide our 406,000 students with continued educational programs that engage them in learning. This collaboration has been truly impressive. Yet, with the recent events surrounding the death of George Floyd, we've seen a large coalition of individuals strongly voice their concerns regarding systemic racism and inequality for those of color, particularly African-American individuals in our country. Never before have we seen this broad gathering of individuals who are passionate about equity and justice for all. The recent protests clearly indicate we have a strong coalition of Americans who want to eradicate systemic racism and bring about unity for all. I'm so thankful to have such strong leaders from our county on this program today. They have dedicated themselves to serving our communities and addressing the issues we are all facing. In my 31 years of education experience in San Bernardino County, I've never seen such strong collaboration and collective impact from our government agencies, nonprofits, and business sectors, and it is so important to work together at this time to make the change in bringing equity and access to all. Again, thank you for your participation, and thanks to all the viewers of this program today. I look forward to this important conversation as we engage in dialogue that will have long-term impacts. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Alejandre. We will now like to introduce our panelists. Mr. Jason Anderson is the District Attorney for San Bernardino County.
Dr. Cuauhtemoc Avila is the Superintendent of Rialto Unified School District.
Mr. Hardy Brown is a board member for the San Bernardino County Board of Education.
Mr. Shannon Dykes is the Undersheriff for San Bernardino County Sheriff Department.
Dr. Will Greer is the Director of Equity and Targeted Student Achievement for San Bernardino City Unified School District.
Mr. Al Jackson is the Chief of Police for San Bernardino Community College District Police.
Mr. Joseph Paulino is the Chief of Police for San Bernardino City Schools Police Department.
Mr. Wes Simmons is the Chief of Police for Chino Police Department. And Mr. Derek Williams is the Chief of Police for our Terror Police Department. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here.
We would first like to start by giving a short timeline of recent events over the last few years to put this moment in conversation in perspective. In 2012, a 17-year-old unarmed African-American high school student, Trayvon Martin, was fatally shot by George Zimmerman while returning to meet relatives in a gated community where Zimmerman was a resident. Following Martin's death and the subsequent trial and acquittal of Zimmerman, the nation saw protests and calls to action to address issues related to racism through racial profiling and the criminal justice system. In 2013, an impartial response to the death of Martin and later events surrounding the acquittal of Zimmerman, the Black Lives Matter movement was established. 32-year-old African-American Philando Castile was fatally shot by a Minnesota police officer during a 2016 traffic stop. The shooting was captured on video and live streamed on social media through Facebook by Castile's girlfriend, who was in the car with him along with her 4-year-old daughter. Immediately after the news of the shooting and death of Castile, protests were held nationwide calling for police reform relating to the issue of deadly force and other issues such as racism, racial profiling, and community policing against African Americans and other people of color. In that same year of 2016, NFL quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick, gained national attention and was the center of much debate for his symbolic pose of kneeling during the national anthem before football games. Kaepernick maintained he was supportive of law enforcement in general and felt his kneeling was to bring awareness to the issues of racial oppression and brutality against African Americans and other people of color. Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old unarmed African American, was fatally shot while jogging in suburbs of Georgia. Arbery was killed after 2 local white residents followed him in their vehicle and confronted him with a gun. The shooting was recorded by another party that was also following Arbery. Arbery's death initially did not garner any arrests. However, after public outcry, an investigation was initiated along with protests and debates about racial inequality within the criminal justice system. 26-year-old African-American EMT Breonna Taylor was fatally shot by police officers on March 13, 2020, after police entered her apartment on a no-knock warrant in Louisville, Kentucky. Taylor was shot 8 times when gunfire was exchanged between the officers and Taylor's boyfriend. After the shooting and her death, national coverage was shown of protests and riots all over the country. There were calls for reform regarding law enforcement, the need to address institutional racism, and the justice system. 57-year-old Christian Cooper, an African-American Harvard University grad and science editor, was bird watching in Central Park on May 25, 2020, when he recorded a negative exchange between himself and a white woman, Amy Cooper, over leashing her dog. Amy informed Christian that she would call the police and tell them an African-American was threatening her life if he did not stop filming. The video sparked outrage and intensified conversations about racism and how law enforcement is used as weapons against African Americans and other communities of color.
Please stop. Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in the Ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the Ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in the Ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
On May 25th, 2020, 46-year-old African-American George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, while being detained by local police. The incident was captured on video by multiple bystanders and depicted a handcuffed Floyd laying face down with a police officer kneeling into his neck for over 8 minutes. Floyd is also heard in the video saying he couldn't breathe, with onlookers also asking the officer to remove his knee. Within days, images and videos were released showing 2 additional officers restraining Floyd and a 4th officer instructing onlookers not to intervene. In the weeks that followed, massive demonstrations, protests, and riots broke out all over the United States and in several other countries. Chants stating "No justice, no peace," "I can't breathe," "Justice for George," and "Black Lives Matter" were dominant fixtures in both social and mainstream media. Calls for law enforcement and justice reform in addressing racism, racial profiling, and the use of force became highly debated, polarizing, and emotionally charged topics. As the nation grapples with high tensions around issues of policing and protesting, it is vital to engage in discourse that advances equity and shares perspective in this, our collective watershed moment.
Here to talk about stress, trauma in the brain is Olivia Dolan, Program Manager, Clinical Services for San Bernardino County Superintendent of Schools.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you guys so much for having me. I feel very privileged to be a part of such an important conversation, and thank you for the invitation, Dr. Sharina, to be here with such an esteemed panel of participants today. I'm going to be talking about trauma, and I will be very candid with you. I've never talked about trauma for 15 minutes. That's a very short period of time. So what I'm going to tell you is that I'm going to leave a lot of information out and skip over a lot of information. But if at any point in time there's something that I share that strikes your interest, please feel free to email me afterwards, and I'm happy to share information and resources on any topic regarding trauma or stress that is of interest to you. So let's jump in. What is trauma? Trauma is essentially an experience that someone has, whether it's real or perceived, that takes away their sense of safety. And when someone is exposed to trauma, it activates a neurological and biological reaction in the body that's outside of anyone's control. It's not something where we can necessarily determine whether something scares or doesn't scare us, creates fear. It happens naturally. And what happens is it takes away people's sense of control. They often feel very helpless, and they lose their sense of safety. And it actually creates neurological and biological changes in the body as a result of exposure to trauma, and can change someone's perception of safety. So where they may have felt safe before, now that same circumstance or situation no longer feels safe to them. Their brain sends a signal or a cue that they're not safe in that environment or in that circumstance. Now, there's not really a way to say what would create trauma in one person over another, because we all have different brains, backgrounds, environments. And so anything could cause someone trauma that may not affect somebody in another way. It really is independent upon the person's brain and their history. So there's a lot of debate in the mental health community, and I want to point that out, and that's regarding the diagnosis of trauma. In our last diagnostic statistical mental health conditions, they did an update to PTSD diagnosis, and they added criteria, because what we're finding as we're doing a lot of studies of the brain is that trauma is looking a lot different than what we originally thought with regard to PTSD. So they definitely expanded it. But what we're finding is that there's a lot of different ways that trauma affects us outside of PTSD. And so there's a real big push in the community to include complex and chronic trauma as a specifier for diagnosis. Now, when we think about trauma, we think about it as a big T trauma or a little t trauma, and both can affect people in similar ways. When we think about a big T trauma, that's something that we sort of think of as catastrophic, something that we can really witness and say, yeah, that's a really big deal. And that's going to really create some major changes in the body and some trauma for that person. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean someone would meet the criteria for PTSD. But what it does is it creates major distress in the body, and the person feels that their life has been threatened. Now, again, we have to remember that it's either real or perceived. It doesn't have to be actual threat of the person. It could be through witnessing or hearing about secondhand, but those things can cause major big T traumas to a person and lead to avoidance of stimuli, mood and metacognition issues, arousal issues, intrusive thoughts, sleep disturbances, all kinds of major changes that affect the dynamic of a person, particularly in their relational functioning, their emotional functioning, behavioral functioning, and their physical functioning. But the other thing that we talk a lot less about is the small t trauma. And these are really important to understand because small t traumas are maybe not catastrophic events that necessarily we would see it and say, oh gosh, how traumatizing, how upsetting. They're things that happen over time that create small, tiny cuts in us. And over time, if you receive all of these tiny cuts, they become a wound and they create an accumulation of trauma that happens in the body and in the brain. And what can happen with small t trauma, we're finding out, is that there doesn't have to be this catastrophic or overwhelming thing that necessarily creates trauma. Over time, when someone is experiencing things over and over again, it actually starts to cause that wear and tear on the body, and it increases their stress level, their tolerance. And it can create avoidance. And one of the things that we know happens with small t traumas is that oftentimes people think, well, that's no big deal. I shouldn't be bothered by this. And so there's a lot of rationalizing people's experience and pushing away from the idea that they might be traumatized by an experience. And these things can be something like a divorce or a separation or an unexpected move. They can be things that are not necessarily something we would traditionally see as trauma, but over time, that accumulation is going to cause an impact on the body. So when trauma happens, it's stored in the limbic system of the brain. And the limbic system is connected with our hippocampus. Our hippocampus is responsible for memory. And it's also connected with our amygdala, which is our fear hub. And so the trauma that happens, it really is stored in that area of the brain. But that area of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, the fear hub of the brain, sends signals to other parts of the brain. It sends signals to the reptilian brain, which is the lower part of the brain connected to the brainstem. And that part of the brain is more of our primitive brain. It's responsible for sending cues and signals throughout the body, triggering kind of our more primitive survival instincts. And it's connected a lot with our fight, flight, and the stress hormones and the cortisol that go off through the body. So what we know about trauma is, or toxic stress, and let me separate those for a second and just tell you, toxic stress is essentially, it's a chronic or prolonged stress that happens, it's ongoing, often outside of our control, and it exceeds our resources, our capacity to deal with the stress. And so that over time can cause a similar stress response in the body to trauma. So it's important to know, we'll use those words interchangeably, but they are a little bit different. What happens with trauma is when it's stored in the limbic system, the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain, which is more responsible for executive functioning, logic and reason, decision making, critical thinking, that part of our brain goes offline, and the trauma is stuck in the center, middle, emotional part of our brain. And so that's why oftentimes when someone is triggered into trauma states, they're not in their deep thinking part of their brain, they're in the part of the brain that is, if you can go back, please, that they're in the part of the brain that is the middle part of the brain. And what happens is our brains get changed and they get wired to expect danger. So they're literally looking out for, once we've been exposed to those traumas, danger that exists in the world around us. Now, it's important to kind of notate the difference between our brain and the different areas of our brain. So the bottom part of our brain is our survival brain. That's our part of our brain that is really, it's not a deep thinking brain. The sole job of the lower part of our brain is to keep us alive. And the midbrain is our emotional brain, making meaning of things, understanding the experiences, the relational part of our brain, and the prefrontal cortex is the thinking brain. Now, it's important to know that if someone's under toxic stress or trauma, and what can happen is their brain gets stuck in a state of hypervigilance, and it affects our cognitive abilities. So you're going to see changes with someone's behavior in terms of difficulty with judgment, difficulty with decision making. Their language and communication skills are going to be impaired. They're going to have behavioral changes, emotional and cognitive changes, relational changes. Also, the understanding of choices and the ability to pay attention. Those things are all affected by trauma. Something important that I think is really interesting is that the normal reaction time of a brain is 1/2 a second. But the reaction time of a trauma brain is 1/20th of a second. So it's literally responding immediately out of this lower part of the brain, and it completely bypasses the prefrontal cortex in the top part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that helps us to logically think something through and make good decisions. Our central nervous system also has a really important role in taking care of our body. Our parasympathetic nervous system, that's our rest and digest part of our nervous system. That's kind of the brakes. That sort of slows the central nervous system down, helps us to calm and to be able to move back up into the higher states of the brain. But our sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight or flight part of our central nervous system, and it's the gas. Its job is to prepare our body for intense physical activity. And so we have what we call the window of tolerance. And what happens is when we're in our window of tolerance, our parasympathetic nervous system is on, we can think clearly, we can dialogue, we have access to parts of our brain that help us to really be well, and we're more regulated. But when we get bumped out of our window of tolerance by toxic stress or trauma, we move into one of two directions. And one is the fight-flight response, which causes us to go into state of hyperarousal, where we're kind of above the window of tolerance. And that's where we're going to sort of we're going to just be reacting based on how we feel. And we're going to be reacting primitively out of a safety state. We don't have access to the top part of the brain, so it's a very anxious state. And there's a lot going on in the body. And then if we're bumped in the other direction into hypoarousal, this is where people become kind of inoperable. They're immobilized by their fear, and they're immobilized by the trauma or the stress that's happening, and they shut down. They can't access the higher part of the brain for deeper thinking. And these are people who often become fatigued, have a difficult time, become easily overwhelmed, and they find it hard to show up and be present. And when we're thinking about how our central nervous system works and how its intention is to regulate our body, it's really important to understand that when people are bumped out of their window of tolerance and have been exposed to a lot of toxic stress and trauma, it puts them at a high risk of developing substance abuse or addiction-related disorders. So here's the thing. When we go through trauma, it makes us feel a loss of control. We feel vulnerable, and often we feel immobilized. And most interactions that happen, what we need to help our brain, to soothe our brain back into being able to calm down and move from the lower part of the brain into the higher part of the brain, is we need environments that feel predictable, reliable, and safe. Now, most interactions between law enforcement and people of color don't feel predictable. Both parties can't be in control at the same time, and so there's no felt safety on either side. And so what often happens is that this recipe of that interaction and those experiences, because there isn't a sense of predictability or control or safety oftentimes, it can lead to interactions between people of color and law enforcement that can either be highly stressful and or traumatizing. So what we know is this, that these two populations, law enforcement and the Black community, don't typically seek mental health treatment services. We know that from the research and the data, and I've put some here for you to see just kind of some of the stuff that's going on in those communities, both populations of people. This is a clash of two highly stressed and or traumatized populations that when they're coming together with very high stakes. And when you're coming together, the higher the stakes of when you're coming together, the higher the risk of traumatization and the higher the risk of vicarious trauma. It's a very intense and very often stressful interaction between the two. And from a lot of the data, we know that not all, but some of those populations are often implicitly trained not to trust one another. So if we're not trained to trust one another, then those interactions that are happening are going to happen in this lower part of the brain. They're going to be happening in a survival brain and in a state of trying to make it through this experience alive. Whether that's real or perceived, that's what the brain is interpreting. And so that's how the interactions and engagements are going to often take place. The Child Traumatic Stress Network says, while a defensive posture is protective when someone is under attack, it becomes problematic in situations that do not warrant such intense reactions. So if there's a stigma in both communities regarding mental health and treatment for high toxic stress and trauma, that means that both populations are not often seeking treatment or support for that, and that both of those populations of individuals are often suffering from toxic stress and trauma. All right, I'm running low on time, so I just want to put these up here to just, I've looked at some data and some research regarding some of the stressful and chronically stressful and traumatizing experiences that go on with law enforcement in their roles. And so one of the things that really stood out to me, and I'll just speak to it really quickly, is the compassionate warrior. So it's this idea of being a crime fighter and a social services worker, and kind of switching between those two roles and how that kind of can be very taxing on the mental, emotional, and physical health. Go ahead and switch to the next one. And what we worry about is that people will be chronically stressed and be exposed to compassion fatigue and burnout and vicarious trauma. And then in the Black communities, we know that there is so much suffering that has gone on. There's been a lot of just inequity that have happened. And so our communities, our Black communities, have often been carrying around, whether it's in their current generation or even through intergenerational trauma experiences, and having them ongoing, these accumulated experiences of discrimination. And remember, we talk about small t and big T. Racism can be a big T trauma, and it can also be a small t trauma. So these accumulations that happen over time, and how those can really affect our outlook of the world and our interactions and the way that our brain is operating when we're interacting, engaging with those who are around us. So that's kind of what I have for you to hopefully frame the conversation around how can we move forward, and how can we create communities where trauma and healing start to occur for our communities of color. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Olivia, for providing a context for how stress and trauma impact the brain and the body's natural response to external stimuli. The San Bernardino County Sheriff Department, in response to calls for police reform, such as 8 Can't Wait campaign to address issues of justice and equity and equality in police reform, have released current policy in regards to all 8 concerns. The Sheriff Department also stated it continues to hold all deputies to the highest of standards while being transparent with the communities they serve.
Now that we kind of have the components to guide this conversation, let's hear from the panel.
Our first question goes out to District Attorney Anderson, Board Member Brown, Under Sheriff Dykes, Superintendent Avila, Dr. Greer, and Chief Williams. What is the most important to learn from the point in time from your lens? District Attorney Anderson.
Daniel, thanks. I think from our standpoint in our office, several weeks ago, we took a stand with some leaders at the Board of Supervisors meeting in supporting the declaration of racism being a public health crisis in San Bernardino. And since that time, I think from our office standpoint, and what I've reflected on is I think it's important for me and our office to kind of pause and listen to the community now, to hear the desires, the needs, the criticisms, the information that we're getting, for more of a chance for me to pause and listen and to take this in, because it's an unprecedented time. And I think what I take away from that is, in order to have my ears open more and my mouth closed, my ears open more with my mouth moving less, it gives me a chance to analyze and hopefully take away some opportunities that we can be involved in the criminal justice system from a prosecutorial standpoint. So that's what I think, that's what I'm learning at this point from our lens from the DA's office.
Thank you. Board Member Brown.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for putting together this conversation. I think it's timely and it's very important, and I think that each one of us want to be able to see the future, and I think that we're on our way. So I'm going to set the stage for a interesting piece for you guys to understand the historical text of where we are. And I love that we have so many chiefs on. These are conversations that you hear, and you hear people say, but you've never seen the terms. And I just did this recently for another webinar, but this is a copy of Alabama Code of Law 1852. And what I want to read for you is something that you hear people say in their arguments all the time, but when I read it firsthand in a primary source document from that time period, it blew my mind because I'd never seen it before. And I just want to read it. It says, and this is a chapter on patrols. At the time, this is different from militia, different from anyone else. The patrols were all white male owners of slaves below the age of 60, and all of the free white persons between the age of 18 and 45 must, by law, perform patrol duties, slave patrol duties. That was their job. And then what is it that they have to do? The patrol has the power to enter in a peaceable manner upon the plantation, to enter by force if necessary, all Negro cabins, quarters, kitchens, outhouses, to apprehend all slaves who may be found not belonging to the plantation or household without a pass from their owner or overseer, or strolling from place to place without authority. The patrol has the power to punish slaves under the circumstances recited in the preceding section by stripes not exceeding 39. That is whipping. And I tell you that because I think one of the things that we have to do as educators especially is to be able to face exactly what happened in our past. We need to be able to say, this was our past. And the Archives of Alabama just announced within the last 48 hours that they actually covered up a lot of history and didn't tell the true story. But I think if we tell the true story, when we look at the trauma that people are going through, and instead of saying, just get over it, don't worry about it, that's not exactly what happened, let's read the code, let's look at the pieces, look at the primary sources, understand that is exactly what we went through, and it just didn't stop there. It's continued on through today in many different ways, and this is a trauma that is affecting each one of us every single day. So the only way we're going to be able to get over it is to continue to talk about it, to see it, and then make an atonement, and then start to move. And I know that Dr. Greer is going to talk a little bit more about this, but I think that we have to be able to look back at our past and say, hey, this is what we did. This is how bad it was. Let's go ahead and fix this, and let's move forward together.
Thank you. Under Sheriff Dykes.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I just want to kind of mirror a couple of comments. And number one, the district attorney, Jason Anderson, said listening. And that's key. I think to humanity, there's three things that just need to be foundational, particularly with what's going on now. And we have a lot of things that we look to, but it's sit back, close our mouths, and listen. And I'm not just talking from a law enforcement perspective, but as a people, as humanity as a whole. Our African-American community right now does not feel equitable, and it's very obvious. And the conversations are different. And when I say they're different, there's a lot of well-meaning and heartfelt people that'll make conversations that think they're showing equity by saying something like, well, I'm colorblind. And a lot of law enforcement officers, I've done it myself in my career, will say things like that, but not really understanding the meaning. And when I say the meaning to the person you're talking to. If we make a statement like that, we truly have no idea what it's like to be in Black skin and what their experience is. So to Jason's point, sitting down and listening, and I'm having more conversations as a result of the things going on in the world that look like that, where you sit across from your African-American friends and neighbors and you have those heartfelt conversations where they actually tell you how this feels. And I think as we move forward as law enforcement, we make sure we hear and we talk about law enforcement function, and then we work as a community in its entirety to see how those things mix. And can law enforcement do a better job? Absolutely. I know you talked earlier about 8 Can't Wait, and we published our policies, but even those policies we can continue to make adjustments to and work with the community to do those things. I'm really glad that you guys are sponsoring this too, because the other piece that we're missing, and the sheriff and I have talked about this regularly, we try to do a pretty good job of having information exchange where we invite a lot of folks from our community in, where they have direct access to the executives in the department and to talk about what the issues are. But one of the things we realized as of late, we're missing our younger generation of folks. And I think by involving this and being involved, particularly at the school level, I think that's most important if we're going to change some of these behaviors and really get down to the human side. And I want to thank Olivia for putting this out too, because I've got to be honest with you, in terms of law enforcement and the African-American community, there are some similarities and stressors that are there. And I think San Bernardino County is right on as far as saying that racism is a public health crisis for a lot of reasons. And Olivia mentioned a lot of those.
Thank you, Under Sheriff Dykes. Dr. Superintendent Avila. You're muted, Superintendent Avila. Okay, we'll come back to Superintendent Avila. Dr. Greer?
I'm right here. I'm right here. You can hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So before answering the question, let me just give you a little context, because to me, everything has meaning and context. And so our country has fundamental divides, be it racial, cultural, or other, that in my opinion cannot be reconciled through policy alone. We live under the rule of rationalistic institutions where all functions are a matter of contention. Eventually, these systems turn on themselves and they abandon their human intent. The person becomes a thing, a number, a statistic in this bureaucratic box, and justice or equity are no longer virtues, but simply things to be negotiated. In education, for example, when making decisions in the best interest of students, it has to go through this negotiation process because we have bargaining units, which is frightening. So the most important thing for me to learn is not to wait for conditions to happen where then one is forced to react. Because positive and long-lasting change cannot come from reaction, because reaction in and of itself does not require thinking. And so to me, we must have initiative and create systems through thoughtful dialogue in order to fundamentally shape the conditions within education that will produce the outcomes that we desire. For example, with us, we are focusing heavily on early childhood literacy because we know the consequences of kids leaving third grade without reading at grade level. We also know the benefits of kids who read at grade level when they leave the third grade. When they don't read at third grade level, we end up spending the next 7, 8 years reforming and intervening. And many times we don't catch up those kids and they are not able to finish education. And then we know the consequences of that. So for me, it's to simply not wait for the conditions to dictate what we are supposed to do.
Thank you, Superintendent Avila. Dr. Greer?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, panelists. Again, thank you so much for having me. You know, I really like this question, and I think this is a very, very critical time. This is an extremely important time, and I think it is extremely important that we understand that policing does not happen in an historical void or a bubble. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that Ms. Dahlin pointed out that human brains are primed to make connections and to seek safety and care. I've been doing a lot of work around this area over the last few years and have recently included some of this in some of the trainings that we're doing out of the equity office. And so I just think to this point, I'm not an officer, I'm not a police officer. I'm not gonna pretend to know the stress and the difficulties and the anxiety that attends that career choice and that lifestyle. But I do think as a Black man and as a citizen, I do think it is important for police to understand, and a lot of us have spoken to context, right? I think we have to point out in this conversation, and it is important for police officers and folks who do that work to first know that, we have to acknowledge centuries of profound, lasting connections that have been formed in the minds of all Americans, particularly whites and Blacks, during 246 years of slavery from 1619 to 1865, roughly 90 years of Jim Crow segregation from 1877 to approximately 1965, to the last 55 years of what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, or the era of mass incarceration. I think we have to address the lasting connections that have been formed in folks' minds when pseudoscientists like John Gray, Sir Francis Galton, Alfred Binet, and many others, stood up in the 1700s and the 1800s and claimed that they scientifically proved that blacks were morally inferior, intellectually inferior, and that whites were superior. We have to ask ourselves whether or not any of those connections still linger in people's minds today. I think we have to address the connections that were made and the enduring lack of safety and care that was shown when efforts to create Black wealth were consistently rebuffed, including the 1921 destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, government redlining from the 1930s to the 1960s, and more recently, the much greater likelihood, the fact that Blacks were 2 to 3 times more likely to face or to receive subprime loans just during the last 10 to 15 years during the last economic downturn. And then, of course, all of the connections that have been formed in people's minds and the lack of safety and care across centuries of racial violence, racial trauma, profound violence on the bodies of Black men, women, and children. Researchers are now arguing that racism is traumatizing to Black people at a cellular level and thus able to be passed down across generations, which means my 2 kids, I have probably given them some of my trauma and some of the trauma that my mother faced when her parents were sharecroppers in Louisiana. And so I think just to understand the impact that this has on African-American stress, anxiety, allostatic load, mental health, physical health, and so on, if I'm an officer today going into the field, about to get into an interaction with an African-American community member, some of these things need to be at the fore of my mind. I hope that there is training, that there are conversations, that there are discussions around these issues, around the connections that have been formed in the minds of both Blacks and Black and white Americans, and our shared need for safety, care, belonging, success, and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Gear. Appreciate it. Chief Williams.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you guys for having me. I love listening to you all speak about these things, and what I've learned. I used to think about what happened here in Ontario just happened in Ontario, but now after all that's going on, what the men and women in this organization do, what the men and women from this region do, can have an effect around the globe, and that's truly important, and we have to reinforce that. As Shannon and Jason talked about, they need to listen more. This is an opportunity for me to talk more. I am a Black man, and I will tell you racism does exist, and a lot of my coworkers and the people in this profession, it's right that they've never had to experience any of that, and their belief that it doesn't exist. But as a chief, I had to get in front of my organization and let them know that it does, and I gave examples of that being a man. So that's been beneficial for us. This the conversation. So as some listen more, I get out and talk more and share experiences. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnect, a lot of the problems we have is because we're not talking as much as we used to. I think that understanding the why, I talk about that, in my household. When I tell my kids to do something, it's why. When an officer goes out and makes an arrest and their family members, all they want to know is the why. And if we can continue to give folks that extra 5 minutes, we'll be okay. We have body cameras here, which are very, very beneficial. Folks are out there creating their own story with their cameras. So we have an opportunity to now police ourselves with these body cameras and, correct behavior and hold folks accountable, and then also reward them when they're doing things the right way. So technology's there. There's a lot of talk going on right now about defunding the police. I think training is very, very important, and California policing is a leader in the industry, and we need to continue to invest in the training, the de-escalation training, the diversity training, just getting out there and doing things the right way. So I think all this is great for us, and we need to just continue to do that. And we in law enforcement, when we mess up, we have to own up to it, say we can do better. And reform is good. I think it's an opportunity to look at things, at how we can do them better. We partnered up with the district attorney's office earlier in the year. We used to just investigate our own officer-involved shootings. As a chief, I know that people don't trust us like they used to, right, wrong, or whatever. But I think having another set of eyes on what we're doing, it will put us in a better position. So we're growing in the right direction, and we just need to continue to do that.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it. Thank you for all your responses. Question number 2 will go to the panelists, Chief Simmons, Chief Paulino, Chief Jackson, Under Sheriff Dykes, and District Attorney Anderson. What practice, policy, behaviors should we stop doing immediately? Chief Simmons.
Okay, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to listen first of all and then speak with you. I think the things that we need to stop doing immediately is stop trying to defend and justify criminal behavior. We need to call out what is wrong and we need to call out what is evil and be willing to do that. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen in this recent movement across the United States, where law enforcement agencies have called out evil behavior. Before in the past, you would see people just stay quiet, not being willing to say anything at all, even though they believed it inside. They didn't want to speak ill of another agency. We're past that now, and when we see evil and when we see wrong, we need to call it out. And I think that's one of the positive things that has come from this, and not just the actions of police officers, but also in the community. When wrong happens, we need to call it that. We need to stop getting our views from 30-second sound bites and through social media, and actually sit down, as was shared earlier, sit down with one another and have discussions. When we can see the world through other people's lenses, it becomes very impactful. As a police chief, I have one perspective. But as a white police chief, I certainly have a different perspective than Chief Williams. And he and I have been able to talk and share, and I've been able to hear those perspectives. And I think in our profession, as Olivia kind of spoke about, is there's a lot of stress there, and people in my profession try and keep it in. They don't like to share it. And for them to be able to share and sit down with their peers, it's been very impactful. And we've seen that in our own department, where we had a department briefing just this last week, and where our African-American officers were able to share with their peers the racism that they've experienced. And that was really eye-opening for those who have never experienced that. And it gave them a greater understanding of what was going on. But making a space for those conversations to take place has been difficult, and this has provided that.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it. Chief Paulino? Chief Paulino?
Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you now, sir. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Daniel, as well as all on the panel, thank you very much. This is a conversation I believe long overdue. It's good to see all on the panel. Dr. Graham, that was well said, friend. I got an education from the information that you sent. I think it's a lot in terms of question number 2 that we can stop. And the first one is to make sure that we stop condoning deviant behaviors. It needs to be addressed by police departments across our nation. And the second thing, we need to stop stereotyping. Stop stereotyping community, marginalizing the community. And it's important in terms of the African proverbs that we see the community. That African proverbs mean that we love the community. So we should take jobs in communities that we love. They say that when you love somebody, it's tough for you to abuse them. So it's important in terms of African proverbs that we love our community that we work in. And then this is piece, I believe, in terms of departments across our nation, we need to stop assuming. And we need to stop assuming that the community knows what happens within a police department. We need to stop the practice of where the community believes that the department no longer belongs to them. And that's the things that we need to stop. And then the last piece I believe that's really important. I believe that we need to start being educators and stop miseducating the community. We have to do our best to be educators, to educate the community on the purpose of a police department. And of course, then we do that through making sure that all the police officers that work for all of us are competent. They're competent in their job, and they're okay around people that don't look like them. I too am a black male. I grew up in inner city LA. I'm clear on sometimes the behaviors that police officers have when it comes to dealing with a black male. Yeah. So I do my best to make sure that I see it from a whole different perspective when it comes to my interaction in the community. Yeah. So we have a responsibility and accountability to make sure that if we work in these communities, that we work in communities that we love. And I believe that we'll see our behavior change if we take that mindset. And I'll leave it at that, sir.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate it. Chief Jackson.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for the invite and allowing San Bernardino Community College District to participate in this critical conversation. Let me give a little context. Some of you know that I came from LA, but what you don't know is that I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I had a opportunity to work the streets as a young police supervisor during the 1992 riots. I also have two African-American sons in their 20s and a daughter in her 20s. And I've had to pretty much sit down and have that talk with them, and I get it. I believe as an African-American male growing up in South Central LA, I have a unique perspective relative to what's going on right now. In fact, in the 1990s, I was honored and privileged to have completed my graduate program over at Cal State Dominguez Hills, where, interesting enough, I did the graduate thesis in the adverse conditions that were present in communities of color in Detroit, Los Angeles, and New York in the 60s. And I predicted then that if the conditions continued, that we would probably be in another civil unrest type situation. And about a year later, we had the 1992 riots that I was deeply involved in. But this question, what practice of policy behavior we should stop doing. Some of the conditions then that I identified in my thesis, and I've had that conversation with my children and lived through that neighborhood, is that controversial modified carotid, AKA chokehold. I think that we should immediately stop using that. I know there's some conversation in Post up in Sacramento, and some of the departments, even ours, we're looking at, as Shannon Dykes pointed out, the 8 can't wait, and our agency is about 7 in compliance of the 8 itself. But the voices across this country have made it extremely clear, and the communities feel that this carotid restraint hold is something that we need to discontinue. And be the truth, putting it bluntly, we can do our jobs in our communities without it. But as Chief Williams said, we as law enforcement officers, especially officers of color, have to do listening, but we also have to do a little bit more talking to express and share some of the experiences that we had growing up in minority communities that folks are feeling very passionate about. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chief Jackson. Under Sheriff Dykes.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So one of the things we need to stop doing immediately when it relates to, we always jump to the defense of anything that happens. And it goes back to what I said earlier about listening and law enforcement function. If we're being transparent, we want to explain why we do what we do. And a lot of times we don't actually hear how it affects the community. So I think if we get to that platform where we can actually listen, and Dr. Greer mentioned this, I believe the same thing. We're at a very critical time right now, and we can make things much better, and we can be in a much better place. But this, I think, is a broader discussion. Certainly police is going to be where the streets are always met by the government. So things usually happen with starting with police forces, but it needs to be more of a human perspective, all of us having these conversations and understanding exactly where we sit. I mentioned 8 can't wait. As far as 8 can't wait, there are a number of things in there. Chief Jackson mentioned one of them, the carotid. Taking a good hard look at that, is that even necessary in law enforcement use of force at this point? There are adjustments that can be made to 8 can't wait. I'll mention shooting at vehicles. That's generally very controversial. There are instances like the terrorist attack here at the IRC where that absolutely had to occur and be able to defend that event. So it's difficult for law enforcement to develop policies that direct an individual beat cop, if you will, through every situation they can possibly explain. So you'll see policies that say generally or things in that neighborhood. I think you're going to see law enforcement as a whole try to become a bit more descriptive. And I've seen this certainly from organizations like the Peace Officers Executive Research Forum and a number of those. Of course, POST was mentioned earlier. So you're going to see a lot of police training change. But I think before we really jump into making those changes and do any what I'm calling knee-jerk reactions, is that they're necessary, but we need to hear from the community how it affects them. They need to hear what law enforcement function is, and I think we can come to a better ground of understanding. And that law enforcement function and transparency is never more important than it is now. We make mistakes. We hired from the human race, and we're going to make mistakes. We need to make sure that we're accountable for those mistakes, and if needed, absolutely apologize. And it needs to be heartfelt so the community understands it, certainly can trust us, and then move on.
Thank you, Under Sheriff Dykes. I appreciate that. District Attorney Anderson. District Attorney Anderson.
Hey, I'm here. Thanks, Dan. I think it's important that we get a different concept, particularly those involved in law enforcement, with an idea of justice that was provided to me several weeks ago by Reverend Jody Moore out of Chino when we sat down shortly after the George Floyd incident in Minnesota. He said that, government exists to bring justice to people. And we often think that justice from the standpoint of going to court and holding people responsible for alleged crimes, proving cases beyond a reasonable doubt, officers making arrests based on probable cause. That's kind of what we have as an idea of justice, and that's what people focus on. But Reverend Moore said in a meeting, he said, justice is the restraint of evil in all of its forms, and that's as simple as it can be. And when you think about that, it takes it away just from a law enforcement standpoint to getting to what Chief Williams said about explaining to the public why we do what we do. And if you're going to restrain evil in all its forms, then all you're going to focus on is you're going to focus on character and conduct, and you're not going to focus on color. And you certainly wouldn't focus on the color of anybody's skin, but I think it goes farther. I think that we don't focus on the color of somebody's uniform. It doesn't matter if somebody's wearing a law enforcement uniform. If it's evil, we restrain it. That's our job as justice partners. It doesn't matter the color of the clothes that I wear. I typically go to court in a suit. I typically encounter people in court that don't wear a suit. That doesn't mean that they have less human attributes than I do, or they're not talented in areas that I'm not talented in. And if they can show their humanity and we can somehow be able to assist in that, then I believe when we are restraining evil against everyone, then it allows people to succeed in society. And so I really have really, when Jody told me that, and I have reflected on that definition of justice as opposed to what we normally think, it's our job to restrain evil. It's on behalf of everybody for people to be able to peacefully protest, to articulate, to lament, which is proper and appropriate, and we need to listen to that. And our job needs to be bigger on the scale of justice than just thinking about what Mr. Avila was saying in terms of it being just a bureaucratic process where humans no longer matter and it's just a number. We need to focus in on the humanity, and I think that definition of justice does it. So get away from color and focus on character and conduct of people, and that's the way it should be.
Thank you so much, D. Anderson. Thank you for your responses.
So question number 3, we'll go to panelists Dr. Greer, Board Member Brown, Chief Paulino, Chief Simmons, Chief Jackson, Superintendent Avila, and Chief Williams. What practice, policy, and or behaviors do we need to start or strengthen to optimize our collective commitment to the children and youth we serve? Dr. Greer.
Thank you. Yet another really good question. I want to just, preface it by again saying, as I'm answering, I'm trying to be, I want to approach it with a certain level of humility and respect for the difficulty of police work. I'm not a police officer. I have nothing but respect for my man, Chief Joseph Polino, and countless others and everybody who's here on this panel. I cannot imagine how difficult that work is, the anxiety that is a part of it, the constant concerns about making it home safely to your families that I would imagine is consonant with that work. So, I feel like I have to give reverence where it is due. At the same time, I think just in relation to the question, Dr. Betters, I think, one thing that we should do just in terms of policing is, I think that we need to understand, and I'll kind of go back to what I was saying earlier, and Hardy touched on this too. I think we need to understand that the past indeed shapes and informs the present. And I was thinking in the research world, there's a theory called post-positivism, right? Which argues that human knowledge is never really value-free or objective. As researchers, we approach our work through a very particular lens with a certain perspective, a certain set of interests, background knowledge, and so on, right? And I say that to say that interaction between any two people, and especially police and African Americans, will include some prior connections and some prior knowledge. And this is simply a kinder, gentler way of saying there will be some bias and stereotypes in these actions. That this will happen is human. The problem is that when it comes to African Americans, there are simply too many instances wherein Black people, even those who are unarmed, end up dead as a result of those biases, and families end up destroyed as a result of those biases, and children lose fathers and mothers as a result of those biases, and psychic trauma is perpetuated again as a result of those biases, right? Which in turn, as one of the previous speakers, Mrs. Dolan, was talking about, has a tremendous, profound impact on our physical and mental health, and the anxiety, the disorders and the sicknesses that show up later. So to that point, I just think this is something that police have to acknowledge and address. This should highly inform the culture and practice of policing, such that white officers should be able to speak clearly and intelligently to the specific ways that Black people have been harmed historically, consistently, and disproportionately during police work. They should be able to name it. They should be able to claim it. They should be able to talk about it. It should be a part of the culture within any police department, from here to the East Coast. This should be a part of that work.
Thank you, Dr. Greer. Board Member Brown.
So I'll go ahead and answer right off of Dr. Greer's piece. And one of the things that I've always been looking at is ensuring representation is at the forefront of everything that we do. When we look at our city here in the city of San Bernardino, does the police force, does our educational force, does our workforce look like the community in which they serve? Do you treat the people who you serve like your own children? And that comes down to a concept of empathy. And empathy is being able to listen to their stories and be able to build some type of combined conversation and understand that we're more alike than we are different. And so I think that making sure, and this is on all of us, it comes from a leadership role. We need to make sure that, at the county schools level, are we looking at our boards and our teachers unions and everywhere and saying, is everybody represented here? Because there are conversations that are going on, and if you're not at the table, you have no clue what's going on. Decisions are being made about policies and things that affect all of us, and nobody's there to have your voice. So we need to make sure that we have that representation. So I've moved out of some of the older pieces into some of the things that, and this right here, this is a copy of Jet Magazine. For those who don't know, Jet Magazine was a staple in the Black community for the last 50 years, 50, 60 years. And this is from 1964. I do have another copy. This is actually from the March on Washington when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. This is the actual original publication of it. But in this particular one, in 1963, in in this particular one in 1964. There's an article and it says, bias, poverty must go, LBJ tells Congress and the nation. And what he's talking about in this article is, as he's doing his speech to Congress, and he says, we must increase opportunities in employment, education, and housing must be open for Americans of every color. We must abolish not some, but all racial discrimination. Members of the public should have equal access to all the facilities of the public. Discrimination is a moral issue and must be met with the passage of the Civil Rights Bill in Congress right now. It's going to take leadership. It's going to take leadership, and it's going to take conversations for us to understand that we walked down this road before, over and over and over again. We've had the same conversation over and over and over again, but we have to get back to that empathy. We have to get back to understanding everybody's story, figuring out how to do that. We have the representation and bringing everybody's voice into the room. I'll end there.
Thank you, Board Member Brown. Chief Polito.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think this is like one appropriate question as well as a public question. Y'all pivot off Dr. Greer as well as Mr. Brown. And I think it's important that we be good example in terms of our practice. We be solid example for our kids, our children, our youths, and our community. And second, in terms of our practice, and we should value them. Yeah. They should be valued. If we say that the kids are the most precious commodity to leave a home, then they should be valued. Yeah, they should be respected. Yeah, we should invest in them in terms of 100% to make sure that they are informed. Yeah, said to them, our kids are 100% of the future. Yeah. So it's important that we feed the future. Yeah. However, I'll pivot off our brother Nelson Mandela's work. Nelson says that the most powerful thing known to man is an education. So we need to make sure that they're educated, not get degrees, that they're educated, they're informed, and informed with information to be able to affect the future. And I believe for policing, it's important that we don't criminalize our kids. That we do our best to make sure that the criminal stairway is the last stairway that we place them on. And that work is intentional, that all of us in the DA's office, all the police chief in terms of our philosophy, and that we ride that philosophy. Yeah. I believe it's this saying that everything rises and falls in terms of leadership, which is Maxwell's word. So we need to lead with that accord, and that our kids are the most valuable thing in our community. And we have a responsibility, as C.S. Lewis say, to our future, that we don't criminalize it. And so you'll see that in the work of police departments in terms of youth programs that they may set forth. However, we have to be intentional with the things that we invest in and make sure our youths know that they're valuable to them.
Thank you, sir. Chief Simmons.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. I think the key is education and engagement with our youth. We were fortunate. We have Pastor Jody Moore, who actually pastors a church and lives in our community. And we did our principled policing training here at the Chino Police Department. He was the one who was able to provide our officers with that historical context. And the thing that surprised me the most is how many of our officers, many of which are college educated, that this history was new to them, and that's a problem. So we need to continue that education, both in the schools and of course in our police academies and in our departments as well. I think the other thing is, and I know that there's a push to remove police from the schools right now, and I think that's the last thing we need to do. We need to have our officers more engaged with our youth and on school campuses. And we've already seen that role of the school resource officer change from what used to be a disciplinarian to really now a mentor and a friend to a lot of these young people, providing positive role models for them. And our SROs have done an incredible job at that. And we need more. We need more connection outside of law enforcement, and more connection with engagement with the parents, with the teachers. And I'll be honest, some teachers are reluctant to have the police officers come to their classrooms. So it makes it even more difficult when we want to break down those barriers and engage with them. So I see as we move forward, that's the key. I'm excited as I saw this movement go across the country with how many young people were involved from all types of backgrounds. And those are the young people who are actually going to join our police departments and have already started to join our police departments and are transforming it from the inside out. And our future is bright, and I'm very optimistic as we move forward.
Thank you, Chief Simmons. Chief Jackson.
Great question. And a lot of things were said already, but let me push forward something that Chief Simmons just brought to light. Back in '92, when we stood on the lines in LA, the demographics and the folks that were protesting and expressing their concerns was totally different from what we're seeing now. And that's good. We're having a great conversation and dialogue. But what are some of the practices and policies that we need to start to strengthen and optimize our collective commitment to the children? It's quite clear. And I think we started in a good direction, as some of the chiefs know. In 2019, the chiefs passed a Senate Bill 230, and the bill statewide created some use of force policies. It had to do with de-escalation and rendering aid and dealing with vulnerable populations, and officers' duty to intercede when they observe excessive use of force. Some of the things that we saw in Minneapolis, and use of force requirements, and most importantly, the training aspect of new officers. Can we do more? Absolutely. And we need to do more, especially to optimize our commitment to the children and the communities that we are sworn to protect and serve. But police reform by itself and in itself will not resolve the social, economic, and racial divides that we see now in our communities and schools and throughout the country. Rather, I think some of the things that we're going to have to look at and take really a holistic approach that incorporates equal education, mental health, which is a big thing right now. We in law enforcement are left with limited funding to tackle this part. Substance abuse is significant for us as well. We need to take the holistic approach when we look at rehabilitation and reentry services, housing, vocational opportunities, and we must move forward with adopting these programs in tandem and strategically. And I will tell you that if we work together like we're having this critical conversation right now, there's nothing that we can't do. So it's definitely a good start, and I look forward to continue the conversation.
Thank you, sir. Superintendent Avila.
Yes, thank you once again. So if we want absolute and meaningful change, we must, and I'll emphasize, we must eliminate the existing system and create a new one, because the system that creates the problems, the gaps, the inequities cannot possibly fix them. We have been reforming forever, for over 120 years in education, and oftentimes we get the same or worse outcomes. But imagine having the freedom to start from scratch. In my example, to start a brand new school district with no limits. Money is not an issue. What would that district look like? What would the schools look like? What would the staff coming in look like? And because this is possible, though not probable, I don't believe that our society is ready for that. So we must operate in the absence of this and transform from within the existing system. So first, we need to define our purpose. Second, we need to define our vocabulary, because vocabulary is the architecture of civilization. It's hard to live beyond our vocabulary. Just as each of us might have our own definition of justice or equity or whatever it might be, the expectation or the outcomes from a point where we're not receiving justice or equity will be different because we have a different understanding of what those words mean. But also we must stay focused on the common center of humanity to create internal systems that value and promote each human being through meaningful relationships and kindness. And in Rialto, our definition of kindness includes two pillars. One is empathy, to be able to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And the second is personal honor or work ethic. And I say that because we can be very empathetic, but be very lazy at what we do. And in that regard, we're not really being kind to those who we are here to serve. We can also, be very hardworking, but be very grumpy in our relationship with others. And that also is not being necessarily kind. And imagine those individuals who are both grumpy and lazy. And we have plenty of those in our organizations. But our goal is to have people who are truly empathetic and truly have personal honor or work ethic, because I believe that only then we can truly exercise the kindness that each of us deserves. And especially when we have to hire the right people. We know that once they get in, it becomes very expensive to remove. But more importantly, we must get to know each other as human beings, not just co-workers, not just service provider and customer, or by title or position and so on. When I came to the district, I shared my story of growing up in Compton and the different experiences, good, bad, and horrible, that I experienced, from living in a garage until I was 15, being shot at, being surrounded by gang activity, drugs, and all sorts of things, that when I shared that with the team, it somehow it humanized me. It made me a human being. They were able to remove the title, the position from me, and saw me as just another human being. And that opened up a conversation among our managers, especially, to get to know each other's story. And ever since, we have not been able, at least I have not been able, to see them the same way after hearing their own challenges, their own traumas, and their own stories. And so in Rialto, we're really pushing hard with customer service, with wellness centers where we address body, soul, and spirit, or that whole child. We're pushing heavily with PBIS, and understand that PBIS is for adults, it's not the students. But this intent has kind of gotten perverted through that contentious process of negotiation. We've also instituted ethnic studies to have our kids to get to know their history and develop that sense of pride within them. And we also have equity teams where we're looking at the data and kind of monitoring the population of kids who are for so many years have been underserved. And so for me, transformation within this contentious system with vicious competing interests requires faith, focus, and persistence from those of us leading, not managing this effort. Transformation requires leaders, not managers, because they are completely the opposite. Position or title does not make a person a leader, and that is my point when defining our vocabulary.
Thank you so much, sir. Chief Williams, with the final word on this question.
Oh, thank you. As we hear, everyone's believing the same thing. Children are important, and they are future. I think that what I tell my folks early on is every contact that we make does not need to lead to an arrest. I think go back to the good old days. If someone's doing something wrong, you call his mama and let her take care of it. And that way there's no cases put on them, and usually moms take care of business and correct behavior. And that's a great thing, because we don't want to limit their opportunities to get great jobs, not necessarily just police work, but other jobs where backgrounds are a part of what they're doing. Chief Simmons didn't talk about it, but the programs that one of his young officers has, that Breaking Barriers, is a great program. It's a young officer talking about the differences between policing and kids growing up, and I think he's a corporal now, but Tillman's is a great example. He's got a lot of charisma. Having folks like that in our agencies to share and tell stories and make contacts with children is very, very important. Wes Simmons also talked about the SRO programs. Those are great, and we have 3 high schools here in Ontario, and we support the SRO program. And it's not just about putting an officer in there. You have to have officers that truly care and want to be involved in the students and their lives, and being a mentor and a leader to them. Those things are very, very important, and that we need to continue, because it also shows that what we do, how we do it, why we do it, and we can truly inspire folks to be good citizens. So we need to continue to do that. And the last part I would just talk about is our hiring practices. I think if you hire from in your city and you have officers that are from your city and live in your city and also work, they'll care, they have buy-in, and that makes it a better atmosphere for everyone. So I just want to thank you for inviting me here, and I don't want to hold anybody up. I know we're done at 3, so thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all of our panelists. On behalf of Daniel and myself, many thanks to County Superintendent Ted Alejandre, all of our panelists who were phenomenal, Mrs. Dolan for being a part of this webinar. For resources regarding topics covered in this webinar, please use the bit.ly link found at the bottom of this slide. You may also go to the SBCSS website under the Superintendent's tab and click on Equity and Access. A special thanks to each and every one of you that joined us today to have this courageous dialogue regarding these very sensitive and crucial issues. On behalf of SBCSS, we look forward to our continued partnerships with all stakeholders, including all agencies of law enforcement, governing bodies, schools, and community members to live up to our mission statement of transforming the lives of students through education. With a closing word, please welcome back Mr. Alejandre.
Thank you, Dr. Betters and Mr. Marmolejo, and just a tremendous thanks to these incredible panelists who are such dedicated professionals to support our 24 cities and 33 school districts in San Bernardino County. Appreciate so much of what was said. You go back to education and educating adults, talking about history, talking about significant issues. Mr. Brown and Dr. Greer and their discussion and sharing of information. I'll tell you, Mr. Brown regularly brings artifacts and items of history to our board meetings and shares them with the board and the public. And when you hear that, you have a greater understanding of why these issues are so important. We had Bernard Kinsey, and I gave a copy of this book called The Kinsey Collection to every one of our superintendents and librarians in our school districts so that we can share that with young adults. When you share the history of African Americans going back to the 1600s, there's so much to learn from and gain from. And so having those discussions is so important. And when Under Sheriff Dicus and Chief Simmons and Chief Paulino talked about being more involved in the schools with our young people. You know, the Sheriff's Department regularly has opportunities for our high schools and their pathway programs for young people to encourage young people to get involved in law enforcement, but also other areas like CSI and aviation. So the more we provide young people with those opportunities, the more they get engaged and have some positive experiences that motivate them for the future. And finally, when you talk about connecting with young people, we have a countywide student advisory with about 400 kids representing all of our high schools in San Bernardino County. And when we ask them, what's the biggest thing that we can do to support your efforts moving forward past graduation, they always tell us they need more adult guidance, more positive interaction, more mentors. The more we can do to connect with young people, to let them know what the options are, that everyone is equal, that everyone has opportunities, the more that we can give them towards direction, towards that future we all want them to have. So all of you are just incredible professionals. Thank you so much for being part of this wonderful program.